All right, let's talk about your final project's first round. Overall, I liked what I see from everybody. I think with some relatively minor tweaks, um, I think you guys could have some pretty solid illustrations. So we'll get started with Zinnia's here, and she has a couple different versions of directed here, directed there, and then an edited edit, which is kind of cool. Um, So we had talked about this in class a little bit, that this one's kind of tricky with the clapper there in the middle here. Um, it's kind of hard to get a letter that works. We talked about having it be the R, but it sort of reads as an R. We talked about trying to have it be the C. It doesn't, yeah, I mean, I see the issues you're having with it. It doesn't quite read well as a C. You could continue to try to play with both of these. I think overall, I like the font choice. We could play with the kerning and the tracking of this a little bit, just to get a little bit more optically even. If we want to think about that assignment. Same thing for this one. This one's a little bit wider. I think it works well. We have a little glitch happening there up here. Anyway, so I think if we sort of, again, kern a little bit, I think for this, I don't know if it's going to work well to have, I'll zoom out. I don't know if it's going to work well to have like these elements a little bit lower. And then you could kind of, I know it kind of doesn't really look like the clapboard anymore, but it kind of gives you, a general sense. I'm trying to just select this guy. There we go. So I want to deselect all of these. I'm going to bring these down a little bit. Oops, wrong one. But you get the general idea. I don't want to bring these windows down, but not windows, but you know what I mean. To make it a little bit more like a C. You could continue to play with that a little bit to sort of split that difference, I think, with the directed. I think it works better as a C than it does as an R. Although the clapboard looks a little bit better there as a clapboard. Um, yeah, that one's kind of tricky though. So it's going to be, if you decide to go with directed, it's going to be kind of like whichever letter you go with and kind of like trying to split that difference. And I think if you do go with directed, um, once you're kind of done with your edit and you have things how you like it, I would start, you know, finalizing these by using our Pathfinder tools. So just for example, if you wanted to actually have these be cut out, you're going to go to Object, and I always forget where it is, Compound Path. So this is basically treated as a compound path, and then select your black shape, go to your Pathfinder, and do that minus front. So now this is like one piece that's actually missing that same kind of thing. And if you wanted to do a similar thing with these and cut it out just to sort of simplify your shapes, right? And again, these are kind of like these visual things that I've talked about throughout class. Visually on screen, they look fine, but if you were to output something like this, like again, for like vinyl, if you were to output something like you would have tiny little pieces. So I would just kind of use your Pathfinder tool and sort of finalize those. But I think if you go with directed, it's going to be sort of splitting that difference between which letter you want to use and which look you want to use. It's a little bit awkward, not to sort of drive you to a different one, but I'm kind of leaning towards, you have an extra path there. I'm kind of leaning towards this one a little bit. So for this one, I like the shadow that you have, the drop shadow on the line there, I think works really well. I think you might even be able to go a little bit larger, like wider with this line. And I don't know if you want to try to use your Pathfinder to sort of cut down the middle of this, because I don't think that would really work. I like the sort of strike through that you have going. I might like give it, personality is not the right word, but I might give it like a little bit of more feel. If you were to like I'm motioning like you can see it. If you were like hand draw a line and strike through, it wouldn't be perfectly straight. So if you wanted to kind of give that line there a little bit of wiggle, for lack of a better word. Not a lot, but just enough to make it look more handwritten. You might even be able to use one of the brushes too, if this was a stroke, um, and if you wanted to play with. Here, I'll just do. I'm going to do a quick straight line here. So even if you wanted to play with a stroke like that, there's a whole bunch of other ones too. If you go to this contextual menu and open brush library, there's like a ton of like artistic, different pens, watercolors, charcoals, etc., etc. So you can see there's a whole bunch. Your charcoals or your squirrel pens might be a little bit much, but you get the general idea. You can kind of like find that sort of sweet spot with where you want that, how wide you want that stroke. And then once you have that stroke kind of where you want it, we can do our, I always forget where it is. I'm looking for outline stroke, non-expand appearance. Anyway, I'm probably going right over it. Where is it? Anyway, you get the general idea when we find it. It should be under object, and I don't know why. I'm probably looking right over it. Path. Oh, there we go, path. That's my professionalism coming out there. So even if you wanted to adjust the path a little bit, but now you have, instead of it being a stroke, you have like an actual like full object you can use. Obviously, you don't want to go that way, but so yeah, I might give it a little bit more like sort of like a hand feel kind of thing. The other thing I might do, again, I like this drop shadow. I don't know if you wanted to put a smaller drop shadow on your edited, or at least kind of like the pen. I might refine your pen a little bit more. Um, Make it's a little bit off angle here. But if you wanted to refine your pen a little bit more and even give like a separate, I'll do sort of like a quickish thing. If you wanted to do like obviously that drop shadow, or even using the same shape and doing that same kind of treatment. If you wanted to have, this is super rough, but you get the sort of general idea. If you wanted to have a similar drop shadow, obviously matching the angle or coming close to that angle to give that drop shadow effect as well. Oops, as I select the wrong thing. To give that, you have that nice drop shadow here, to give that drop shadow a little bit here so it's not like floating, if you want to think about that sheer. And then again, once you're all done, if you do go with this illustration, once you're all done with this, again, using that Pathfinder to join all this up. So now you have one solid shape rather than you're still separate shapes there. But yeah, I think depending on which one you want to go with, some relatively minor tweaks, and I think you could have a really solid design overall. All right, we'll go to Reese. So we have going to Reese. So we have dance. So I like the music elements you have. I think a couple of things here to refine this a little bit more. I would definitely outline your type so that you're working with objects rather than text. You can keep an editable version off to the side if you really want to. I just did that twice. Just do that quick copy. Oops, here we go. Just do that quick copy if you wanted to keep that, keep that out there. I might try a different font. Like you don't want to use like a Comic Sans sort of thing, but like something that has a little bit more personality for the word dance. But I like some of the effects and some of the things you have going on with like the musical notes. But if you outline, I was going to do shortcut, but so under type, create outlines, and then now you have, and then I'm going to ungroup them. So now you have these separate pieces you can kind of work with. And if you wanted to group these together, and, even give it in a little bit of motion, and even if you wanted to kind of adjust, the angle of some of them, just to give it a little bit more motion, a little bit more feel, something like that. I'm trying to find that. There we go. Oops, I don't like that. But again, you get the general idea, kind of giving it a little bit more feel, a little bit more motion. And then again, with this one, I would say definitely use those Pathfinder tools. And once you have your fonts outlined, you can select all these guys, use your Pathfinder, and now you have solid objects. And the same thing here, instead of using, it's a good start, but instead of using the shapes to create that look, you want to finalize it, right? So if you use this one and this one, and did that minus front, now you have that like solid object. And same thing with the letter D there. So now you just have that solid object. And here again, you're going to want to create outlines, outline stroke, and then you can join these two. And so now you have that like solid letter. So I think this one, like adding a little bit of personality, a little bit of motion, even just by simply rotating some of these in different ways. And then I don't know if you wanted that, if these were on a specific staff or not. The same thing with the E here, making that one solid shape. And if you wanted to sort of jumble it and give it, again, a little bit more personality, but I think I think this is a really good start. And I think that again, creating a little bit of that movement and then definitely using that Pathfinder tool to finalize your shapes so that you don't have all these separate shapes still. Again, for output is where this would make a huge difference. Visually on screen, not so much, but for output, you want to have it as simplified as possible. All right, and we'll check out Samantha's here. She and I were talking in class the other day about this, the alarm bell. I think you did a great job with that alarm bell, giving it sort of a three-dimensional look. It's a little bit small in your illustration. Even if it's a little bit bigger than the dot on an eye, I might, go for it and really make that, all of this a little bit bigger, just to sort of, give that a little bit more visual impact. You might have to play with your font there a little bit. I just made that a lot larger. And I think these are kind of what I'm guessing. And again, we can talk about this in class, but I'm guessing that these are sort of noise-ish lines that you have going on. Pardon my dogs in the background. I'm guessing that these are kind of noise lines you have going on in the background. But yeah, I might separate them a little bit just to give them a little bit of a separate look. I'm kind of annoyed with my dogs. I want to start over, but I don't really feel like starting over. But just kind of like separate them just to give them that sort of, I don't know, those motion lines that are coming off of the object, right? Or even if you wanted to simplify it and just have, you could use, I'm gonna take this apart here. Even if you wanted to have the sort of more classic-ish, so I'm gonna do a copy and I'm gonna paste behind. Even if you wanted to have, if this is indeed what you're doing, I'm not sure that it is. Give yourself these kind of pads, and you could kind of make it, and you can adjust too and make them, make these curves smaller, larger, etc. Just by using different size circles and getting rid of a couple of those points. But if you wanted to have it look like, the sort of alarm bell was ringing kind of look, like that's an idea as well, to give it that alarm thing. And then as far as your fire goes, I like what you have going on with the gradient so far. I might, one of two things. If you wanted to have it look like the fire was on just the objects here, and then here's another spot where you're going to want to, if you want these to be one flame, combine those shapes. So decide which shapes you want to be combined. So like, for example, if you want these to be combined, and then, simplifying your shapes, and then you can use your eyedropper tool here, and then you might need to refine a little bit, but if you wanted it to look like the letters were on fire, you could even arrange some of the objects behind and front, etc. Like I might play around with that. Or what you could do is, another idea is, again, outlining under type, creating outlines. Oops. Ungrouping that. And then if you wanted to select these and then make that one object using our eyedropper tool, if you wanted to make it look like, you know, um, the whole letter was on fire. So it just depends on kind of the direction you want to go. You could start it to where like some of these are, even if you started with the F being more on fire and then some of them less and less on fire, kind of like your exclamation point. I might make our exclamation point way bigger too. Maybe not that big, but definitely taller than the I. So it depends. If you wanted to have like this kind of look, or sort of this sort of look, you might need to refine your the bottoms of where your fire flames are, I guess. But so that's one idea is like having. I'm not sure now that I did it. I'm not sure that I like it, but having the objects fully look like they're on fire, or having the objects look like there's little flames coming off of them, or you can again kind of go for you know less flames on this side, more flames on this side. There's a couple of different ways you can go with it, but yeah, I like where you're starting. I think again, just like a little bit of refining, and I think you would have a solid project for this one. All right, going to David, and his was pretty funny. I actually don't mind this idea. I kind of like how sort of abstract it is. I think for you, it's going to be sort of cleaning up a little bit, and then um, like if you wanted to have this sort of idea, are these like they're all grouped, ungroup or not? I'm trying to ungroup like crazy. Why is this not ungrouping? Let's see. Let's go into our layers here. Oh, it's an image. That's why. Oh, okay, I see. Okay, so for this one, I'm assuming since it's an image, you might have done it in Photoshop and then placed it into Illustrator. I would recreate these in Illustrator. I'm not sure why it's showing up as an image. But yeah, I might kind of refine if you wanted to have this kind of look, again, just with your sort of simple shapes. But I might refine it to where, there we go. I like your sort of color palette you have going on. I might refine it and sort of oversimplify. Yeah, here. I'm going to use my eyedropper to pick up this color and then throw. I was going to throw a black stroke on it, but we won't do that quite yet. But you get the general idea. So like rebuild that shape, and I might have it just like a solid shape, and then kind of just have it like outline it. Like this. Let's start here-ish. So I might outline it like this. So basically build your shapes, right? And then use those use that Pathfinder to create your overall shapes, and then do a copy and paste in front so you have a separate object. And then I would throw a black stroke. Oops, it's already got a stroke on it. And then I would do, where am I supposed to do this? Let's go to color, do a black stroke, and then, however big you want to do it. Okay, and then I would do, this is where I would refine here, sort of similar to the fire bell. Might be a little much, but basically give yourself a little bit of an outline, so you don't have the whole shape outlined. So you're basically kind of like outlining the cheeks, so to speak, and then you could have, one leg, two legs, and then the rest be like that blue background, right? So you don't have so many lines, right? And sort of, refine it as like a super simple abstract illustration, right? And then similar to here, like if you wanted to use, have your, your hot pink background, go to here so that you had this nice hot pink blue background. And then I would actually have this spread out a little bit more, have your T way large, and then going down to the F. I like the idea of your gradient. I might adjust your gradient a little bit more, and then these lines I would definitely refine, maybe make them a little bit more illustrative. Again, you can kind of potentially play around with a stroke. I'm just going to make it black for now. And then play around with brushes on this one. I might open up your brush library and then see which. I don't know if these are mine or they're in Illustrator. But even if you went to like charcoal, and then that would give you different, different types, and you could experiment with which one that you like better, and then you can kind of get that sort of similar look. But if we're going to go with, right, if we're going to go with a fart, you might as well really go for it, right? And then again, sort of like the sound waves, the sound waves emanating, but this way you can kind of, give it sort of more that grungy look, like grossish kind of look. But I like, I like the simple illustration. I like the concept. I think it's fun. And I think again, just kind of like solidifying your backgrounds and just kind of making it look a little bit more, making it look a little bit more illustrative, where we have, both cheeks there. This is kind of messing it up, but refine a little bit more than that. And then again, you have, this way you have more of your background there, and then you could have, one leg there. You could still do it with circles, but I would have, do I have another circle? No. Your solid blue circles there, and then throw that behind, and the same kind of thing, and then refine this circle a little bit, give or take. Obviously, you can do it much better than I'm doing it now, but again, you sort of get the general idea. Give it a more illustrative feel, where the one leg is coming off. One leg is coming off here. And then depending on where you want the other leg. And then I might have this just go straight up. And give yourself a stroke on the outside of that. I forget how big we made it, but you sort of get the general idea, and then again you have to refine these, move these to the back. So see, this way now it looks like it's already looking a little bit more like illustrative cheeks, so you get the kind of general idea. And then have like this whole thing here be a pink background. So I think yours is going to be sort of refining that, refining that idea. I like the abstract idea you have, but I think it needs a little bit of cleanup. I like the concept. I think it's fun. I think keep going with it. I think you have a really cool illustration. All right, McKenzie's. You and I have talked about this a bunch in class. I think this looks great so far. I think for you, it's going to be a little bit of tweaking. I might play around with. Oops, I didn't mean to copy it. I might play around. Oh, there are two copies there. I might play around with, where the placement of these are, like going into. Some more copies there. Going into his mouth or her mouth, going into its mouth. I might play around with, where you have these things. So it looks more like there's so much space in between these two, or at least have the S, move the A and the B over. There we go. Move the A and the B over a little bit, and then have the S kind of like, even if you rotate it a little bit, but having the S look like it's going in there, or even move the O a little bit more over to the left, just to, as he's eating them, as it's eating them, having it, not so separately grouped, if that makes sense. And then I think I like what you've done with the objects on the inside. What I might do with these, I'm gonna lock these guys so we can just play with these. So what I might do is, I like the idea that you have. Let me go into your layers here. Okay. I want to send all of those, right? What I might do is I might reverse these guys, right? And then play around with those blending modes. Like you've already sort of started doing it. I might play around with those blending modes and your opacities so that you have the pink still. And you could use usually like hue or even color. Those are pretty similar. So this way you still see some of the, your highlights there, right? And then with the different opacities that you have, again, for hue, you could play around with the different opacities if you wanted to do this one like 90-ish, right? Do this one a little bit less. Bring that even down to 70, 75, give or take. You'll find what you like there. And then even bringing this one way down so it gets that sort of grayish look, 40%, give or take. But I would have them on top and then play around with that layer order, or not layer order, that opacity and the blending modes, just so you get, the highlights are over it. So it gives you that sort of more depth, I guess. So yeah, so I think this one is going to be, again, kind of shifting this a little bit, just to sort of make it look like he's eating it. Maybe even, move this, move him around so it almost looks like he's eating them as a line, kind of, right? But just kind of like playing around with location and just, giving it a little bit more flow, and then playing around with those blending modes. Having these letters on top and playing with those blending modes, I think would help sort of give it a little bit more depth. But I think this illustration is great, and I like your concept. Okay. Moving on to Erika. This one is also very cool. So, I think for this, I think there's just a little bit of refining for this one. Again, I think maybe your kerning looks pretty good. I think this kind of optically throws it off a little bit. So you might want to adjust, maybe make your kerning slightly wider overall, just so your letters optically look a little bit more even. I might actually even play with this. You already kind of have it, but I might make that a little bit wider. I'm going to kind of like break it by moving it, but I might make that a little bit wider just so it's more noticeable, at a further distance. You might have to play around with where you're, well, no, you won't. You might need to move this one line just slightly, so it lines up there or whatever. And then a couple of other things. For you, I would play around with your shapes so that you have this as one compound shape, right? And then I might play around with gradients on this one. Let's go to our fill. So if you have like a gradient fill, obviously you don't want orange, but what I was thinking is if you had, the bright yellow going to sort of lighter yellows, you can even simplify this gradient a little bit more. Give that about 50%. And then going with, let's go with our swatches here. So that's about the same color. Oops. Anyway, but you get the sort of general idea if you wanted to go and even going with this one, going to like an off-whitish. You might not even need that middle one. But I might play around with like essentially kind of how the light spreads a little bit, right? So I would play with your gradient slider there. Maybe see if you might need another color or not, and then even play around with the location of your gradient as well. Um, it's kind of hard to see, but you see how it's kind of moving as I'm moving my location a little bit to where there we go. It sort of stays more yellow on the top here and then goes from like yellow to your yellow to off whitish there. Again, if you wanted to go with another yellow there just to give it that, you know, just to give it that light spread, just to give it a little bit of that light spread, right? As it sort of diffuses going towards the bottom there. And then if you wanted to, I would try it, see if you like it. I might add some creek lines, if that makes sense. And again, you can refine it a little bit more, but kind of like Sam's fire bell there. Ooh, that's not what I want to do. Like Sam's fire bell there. If you wanted to add some like creaking lines where like the hinges might be, or you can even mimic this shape by copying and pasting the A. But give it some potentially. This might be a little bit too on the nose, but if you wanted to sort of give it some creek lines and even have them down at the bottom or at the corners, give or take. I don't think you'd want any here, but you know what I mean, just to give it a little bit of that, like the classic illustrative sound lines. You know what I mean? But yeah, you could either do it with the circles, you could even refine again and sort of like match that shape if you wanted to. But yeah, I think that and playing around with using your Pathfinder, making that a solid shape, and then playing around with a little bit of light diffusion, I think could really sort of shore this one up. That'd be really cool. All right, going to Naya's. All right, so I really like the concept of this one. I saw you working on this one in class. I don't mind the idea of having this image as a guide. But what I would do is I would kind of and you can even simplify it, but I would recreate something like this in Illustrator. You kind of already started there with that, having that hook be there. Um, First, I might spread these out a little bit. I'm going to ungroup them, and then we'll grab your crane, move it over a little bit. But yeah, I might spread these out just a little bit. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Give or take 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. But give them a little bit more distance, and then kind of give that one more distance than you think. So it doesn't look like it's really in place yet. And then yeah, I would recreate this, which might be a little bit tedious, but it won't be too bad in Illustrator. But this way you can kind of like get rid of what you don't need. But this is basically just going to be a lot of tracing. But basically, if you go back to our favorite snowball kid, right? And you can go with a different color. Go with a different color stroke just so you can see it. Usually, if I'm tracing an illustration, like I'll go with like a bright, obnoxious color just so I can really see it. But yeah, I would sort of trace this and just turn this into a vector object, right? And then once you have, it's going to be a bunch of lines. Once you have one, you can kind of use your quick copy and just holding shift and dragging, right? Or actually, once you have, I'm going to rotate this. So pretty much once you have one, copy, paste in front, and then I'm going to flip this, hit OK, So then once you have, obviously you tighten it up a little bit more than I have, but once you have like one box created, now it's just kind of repeating that and just kind of keep going with that. And you can even, oops, I undid, redo. You can do that, think about our transform section. But even if you just, copied it over and over and over again. And then once you have that one done, basically once you have one of these things done, there we go. Once you have one of these arms done, you can copy, paste in front, and then you might need to do a little bit of reflecting, flipping, etc. But then you already kind of have the top part, the top arm, whatever you want to call it, done. You might need to refine it a little bit, but for you, I would vectorize this. It's basically going to take a little bit of drawing, a little bit of drawing, but pretty simple shapes overall. You can group them once you're done. But yeah, instead of using the image, I would just make sure it's all vector. I think your concept is really strong. I think it's really going to be for you. It's going to be sort of redrawing this. It's going to be kind of tedious and a pain in the butt, but I think once it's vector, it'll look a lot smoother. And then again, just sort of giving these a little bit of space and bringing this one out to the right a little bit more, giving it a lot more space. If you wanted to play around even towards the end, if you wanted to add a little bit of like a shadow, that would be fine too. But I think overall, even sort of nitpicking and lining this up so it's at the same sort of level. It's sort of nitpicky, but I think it sort of helps to visually solidify everything, for lack of a better word. But yeah, I think for you, it's going to be overall, recreating this as a vector illustration, which isn't going to be necessarily difficult, but just a little bit, not even that time consuming, but just kind of a rough sort of pain. But I think overall, it'll look a lot cleaner. You'll have a much tighter illustration, but great concept and draft overall. All right, going on to Connors. There we go. So I like this concept a lot. I think that you could, really simplify this, right? So what I might try to do is, honestly, sort of get rid of that. You can rearrange your stars a little bit. I'm assuming you're kind of going for like a mountain zenith kind of thing. I like what you've done with the gradient and how it sort of like disappears into the black there. But yeah, what I might do is kind of continue this idea, even stretching out that Z a lot more to really kind of make it look like, more sweeping like a mountain range. And even if you wanted to kind of play around with the tops of some of your letters, I'm going to ungroup, separate this, ungroup. No, it's not going to let me ungroup, huh? Let's see, why is it letting me? I'm going to expand that. Oh. I'm not sure why it won't let me ungroup that, but anyway, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to select just this guy, delete it, and then just make our own circle. If you wanted to make this more the moon, I'm assuming, or sun or whatever, even if you want to have it, you could adjust your gradient a little bit. But yeah, I would kind of like continue this, really emphasize that sort of mountaintop-ish thing you have going on with the Z here. Again, even kind of like pulling some of these much longer, and this one's just going to be kind of playing around with, oops, where you want those, mountaintop-ish kind of looking. That's a little bit rough, but you get the general idea. But really sort of emphasize that mountaintop, and even if you wanted to have these, the E, and then it kind of look more like the letters there, and then kind of look to that as more of your moon, and then kind of so you can spread out your stars over that. I think that illustration on the top was a little bit cluttered. I think with just the word and some of your illustrative elements, um, I think you have a strong concept and a strong idea already. I think it was just a little bit cluttered um, with that sort of object that was up here. I think you could kind of do a similar thing with just using what you have with the letters already, right? And then you could even take your background there, unlock it. Oh, there we go. And then give yourself, depending on where you want that illustration and drawing board to be. You could even resize your artboard a little bit, right? To there. Resize your artboard a little bit just so it's not so cluttered. But yeah, I think that top illustration kind of cluttered it a little bit. I think you can kind of have that same concept and have it a little bit more refined just by playing with what you had at the bottom already. Just sort of give it that sort of mountaintop-ish look. But I think overall, it's a super strong concept. All right, let's check out Wilbur's here. Okay, so for this one, I don't mind the concept. I think I want you to push it a little bit more than that layers project that we had, right? So even if you want to kind of include that magnifying glass, if you want to go back to that, oh yeah, first I would outline. Is there are there two here? Why is oh yeah, there's that one. Okay. I would take this one that's inside your clipping path and make it bigger. Even if you just had those two letters, it's fine. Yeah, inside your clip group. There we go. Even if you wanted to have, get rid of those letters, but I would have this kind of, you'll have to match it up a little bit, or maybe you can choose a different letter, where your magnifying glass is, but make it look like it's actually magnified instead of the same size. But one of the other things I might do is I'm guessing this is kind of like a flashlight kind of thing. Um, so again, if you outline your stroke, you can get rid of that, or not your stroke, outline your text and turn it into an object. You get rid of that, the dot on the eye instead of trying to cover it up. But what I might do is if this is supposed to be kind of a flashlight thing, I would actually, again, give it a little bit more detail, but make it look more like an actual flashlight and maybe even angle it a little bit. So if you got rid of that dot on the eye there we go. If you got rid of that dot on the eye there, you could have your flashlight-ish here, and then you can even maybe do a beam of light with a gradient coming out of the flashlight. You could sort of simply draw it if you wanted to. If you wanted to draw sort of a simple shape. And then I'm gonna have to adjust that, but you get the general idea. I'm trying to sort of match that. There we go. I was kind of trying to match that. There we go. That angle, give or take. So anyway, you get the sort of general idea. Oops. Refine this, and then if you wanted to have, a gradient on that, and again, play around with the gradient. Put it behind here, play around with the gradient so it's yellow going to white maybe, and then you can play around with the opacity or even your blending modes. So if you go to your appearance and opacity, and then just kind of play around with different blending modes to see, since it's a black, well, like something like that even might be kind of cool. But, play around with the different blending modes. There you go, something like that. But if you wanted to make it look like that, flashlight-ish kind of thing, sort of push it beyond that assignment that we've already done. Or even if you wanted to have these, let's say for argument's sake, I'm going to reflect those. So even if you wanted to have this one going this way, so you had more, you have this action kind of going left to right, and then this action, or rather right to left to right, and then this one right to left kind of thing. You get the general idea. So I think sort of pushing it beyond that first, not first, but pushing it beyond that magnifying glass assignment we had already. And I think refining your shapes and then playing around with adding a light beam, making it look more directly like a flashlight to sort of give it more, more visual effects. And then not playing around, but outlining your stroke, or I did that again, outlining your text. So object, or type rather, create outlines. And then now it's an object rather than, you're going to have to move these. Why won't it let me select that? Why am I not seeing? Oh, show edges, that's why. There we go. So now you can just delete that. And now that pesky I dot isn't in the way. But again, you can refine this a little bit, and then you can even spread the angle if you want that angle a little bit further, that kind of stuff to give it, refine it a little bit more visually, give it a little bit more visual interest, and expanding beyond that magnifying glass assignment that we've already done. All right, and then Ivry. There we go. I like this idea. What I might honestly do is kind of push this towards like the linear perspective drawing, and have this kind of go the other way, if that makes sense. Like, so have your outside letters, literally just flip it. Your outside letters be larger, inside letters be smaller. So the perspective goes back towards the middle. And then you could play around with adding this kind of thing, but I have this pulled up here. Where is it? I don't have it pulled up. There we go. So like look at like linear perspective drawing, right? So if you wanted to add sort of a little bit more illustrative element, if you think about these kind of, well, this is a lot. That's not what I meant to do. Like if you scroll through these kind of images, if you wanted to have, this sort of city-ish kind of look where you had, your words going back and then adding like a street, or adding like, adding something beyond just the perspective put on the word, right? That's where I was kind of thinking of like these sort of street scenes, right? So sort of like this, if you have perspective, perspective going down this way and this way. And you could, do that really simply, again, just by creating lines in Illustrator, something like that, or even if you did like 1 point perspective. So it'll give you, similar results, but, like, again, sort of simplify, a line drawing, but adding a little bit more visual, a little bit more visual interest, right? So if you had, again, even if you had one word, perspective, fading back to the background, and then had like a city or street image, on the other side. So it goes back. Oops. Oops, I'm messing around with the anchor. Anyway, basically flipping what you have there and giving it sort of that like that street-ish view, so you have another illustrative element to go along with it beyond just having the word, give that perspective, sort of a visual anchor, for lack of a better word. I think this is a good, simple idea, but it might be a little bit too simplified right now. Again, adding sort of like a little bit of an illustration, even if it's a civil street going back down to the middle, right? And you could play around with having it be on either side of the street, so you split it, so you have, this is going to make your word backwards, but you get the general idea. If you had like sort of like this on one side of the street find that spot visually, and then have your street kind of going this way with the lines down the middle, something like that, just to give it a little bit more visual interest, right? Again, I like the concept. I think that your draft might be a little bit too simple. But yeah, so I think looking at some of those one point perspective or even linear perspective drawings, you'll get tons of ideas. Even if you use the grid, um, I always turn it on by accident. Perspective grid, so you can kind of show a perspective grid, and you can swap this as well. You can play around with your grid, and we can go over it in class a little bit, but um, you can even swap this, and so that way you have like a more visual guide, a visual guide to work with. It's similar to the shortcut that we have, and so I always forget. I think it's an insert. Anyway, so I turn it on by accident all the time, and I forget how to turn it off. But this would be a time where you would want it on, and maybe work with that perspective grid to give you that visual to really kind of have your perspective look pretty optically correct. But yeah, I think overall it's a great concept. I think adding some more details to it could work really well. All right, then we'll go with Nina. So I like this idea a lot. What I might do is, this is going to be sort of quick and dirty. What I might do is give yourself a little bit of room, and I might actually just sort of spread these out a little bit more. Depending on how you broke it apart to begin with, this might be a little bit tricky, but what I might do is like maybe kind of find like a central point, if that makes sense, right? So like if you were, let's say this is one solid object, right? And you dropped it and like hit here first, it would like spread out from this central point further out, like radiating out, if that makes sense. And then what I would do, honestly, is I would spread these out a little bit more. Oops. I would like pick and choose, but I would sort of give these a little bit more space from each other. And you could kind of have some be closer, some be further, but give it that sort of more, not random look, but depending on how far you want these. But I would give it a little bit more spread, like this. So yours is largely going to be like playing around with, how far you want things spread out, and even playing with angles, things like that. If you wanted to grab all of these, move those a little bit away. So it's, there's going to be that um, splitting that difference between too much room and having it a little bit tight like this, right? Some of them could be as simple as just moving that down a little bit, right? And then lastly, what you can potentially do, this may or may not work, for your gradient, if you wanted to play around with your gradient instead of having a gradient on each one of these, and watch, this totally won't work at all. Yeah, no, I don't like that. I was going to try to do, let's try a radial gradient, bringing it out from the center here. Yeah, no, I thought maybe having one continuous gradient. No, I think it definitely works better as multiple. I was wrong on that one. I figured I'd try it. Ooh, what did I do there? Holy cow, I don't know how I did that. Oh, I guess it just visually looks, I feel like all of a sudden visually it just got blurrier, but generally you get the idea. It's going to be sort of like splitting that, um, sort of splitting that, I'm going to revert and see if that changes things. Yes, I do want to revert. There we go. I changed our gradient too much. But I think sort of like spreading things out a little bit, and sort of looking at it's hard to make things look random without sort of purposely looking random, if that makes sense. So I might play around with where you have some of the shards, I guess, spread out, so make it look a little bit more random, and it could just be like minor, again, like minor tweaks where you're, oops, you're kind of spreading one out more than the other. You get the general idea. I'm kind of repeating myself there. But I think it's a super solid concept. And I think just kind of, again, having that, in spots, having that sort of, finding that sweet spot between too little space and too much space, right? But yeah, I think overall it's a great concept. Right, we'll go to Daunte's. If I can find it. Final projects with Taylor. There it is. So, again, I like the idea. I like the start of this. I think for you, it's going to be sort of like adding a little bit of dimension to this. And I think one way you could do that is I am going to, we can use our offset path, right? If we go back to that assignment, however long ago it was. So I'm going to offset this path, and you can kind of find where, um, how large or not you want it. I like to usually go with a round rather than a bevel joint, just because it gives you a smoother corners. And then now you'll see you have cut, paste behind. So now you kind of see you have two different shapes there, and then you can kind of find a green that you like. Oh, that's right, there's opacity on this. So for this, I would leave this one normal. Yeah. And then select this one and go normal as well. So this way you kind of have a little bit more, it sort of gives the idea of dimension. That might be a little bit too much. But you sort of get the general idea, even if you wanted to find a color that was similar. More similar to your original color there. This might be a little bit too much spread, but sort of give it a little bit of dimension, right? Even if you wanted to change the gradient colors a little bit, if you wanted to have it, go to my eyedropper. So even if you wanted to have a gradient there as well, then you can even kind of match. Sort of match the gradient-ish. If you kind of wanted to start kind of there. Give or take, I'm just kind of playing around here. Even if you wanted to have a gradient and have it be, let's go back to our gradient. Make that color much darker. Even make that color a little bit darker. Basically just to kind of give it a little bit of dimension on each one of the words. You'll find that, like I keep saying sweet spot, but you'll find that sort of sweet spot. I think I made the outline a little bit too large. But I think just to give it a little bit more dimension, right? I think I like the concept. I think it's a little bit flat right now. So I think, even if you did an offset path, even by a lot less than I just did. And then either playing with the gradient or even playing with having it be, a lighter or darker color or close to this color. So it gives you a little bit more dimension, a little bit more body to it, right? But yeah, I think overall it's a good concept. I think it's going to be refining it a little bit to give it more like dimension, right? All right, let's go to Taylor's. Here we go. All right, we talked about this a little bit in class. I think you have a great concept. I like what you've done with the gradient there, and I kind of like what you've done with the Y and the tears falling down. I wonder for this if you had your teardrops coming off of the R, maybe you might need to change your Y up a little bit, but coming off of the R maybe and doing kind of, even if it's abstract, but doing it like it might be too on the nose, but doing it so it looks like this is an eyeball, right? So you have it like legitimately like coming out of, have some tears coming out of that eye, right? And then you can even have this sort of wanting to snap for some reason, having these drops kind of look like they're coming out of an eye. That might be a little too much, but you get the general idea, right? Even if it was like somewhat abstractish, if you drew and just set it behind, stretch that out a little bit, and then you can even have a pupil in there, make it black. Again, this is sort of super fast, but you kind of get the jokes. I need to go back to my shape tool. Even if you had that might be a little too much. Make that overall a little bit smaller. You sort of get the general idea. And then lastly, I would add some highlights, right? So if you had, even just copying the shape, right? So I'm going to do a copy, and a paste in front, right? So you have these, and then I'm just going to sort of nudge that over a little bit, and then use our handy pathfinder. Even if you wanted to, you can make this a different color just so you can see, see where you have that highlight a little bit, and then use our handy pathfinder and cut, and then make that white. So just to give it a little bit more depth, that might not be exactly, you obviously put a little bit more time into it than I did. And then if you did basically the same thing here, copy, paste in front, make it a totally different color so you can see. Make this a little bit bigger here so we have a little bit more overlap. And then use our pathfinder, and then you can, oops, I did the wrong one. And then make this white. But again, give it a little bit more, you can even, that might be a little big, but you get the, oops, I just wanted to, there we go. Just to give it a little bit of shine, and you can even make it smaller. But just to give it a little bit of a highlight, obviously refine it a little bit more than I just did. But even as we back out a little bit, now already that's got a little bit more depth, right? So I think maybe try, that might be a little bit too much, but, try maybe drawing sort of like an abstract eye behind it, see if you like it. And maybe even throwing I'm going to reflect this so it's on the other side. So your highlights are in the same spot, or your light source is coming from the same spot, right? Or if you want to make the highlight at the top there. But you could use the same path on top of, copy and paste in front, and just sort of nudge. I just use the arrow keys. Just sort of nudge it a little bit, and then use that pathfinder to cut another shape to add the highlights. I think you could have a really strong panel for this one. All right, let's go to Laney. So we have, oops, sorry. So I like this idea. What I might do, I think you have a whole lot of pieces here. And if you wanted it just to be solid black, this is where I keep saying the Pathfinder this whole time. But I would select these. Use your Pathfinder. Why did it do that? Oh, you want those to be, some of these are, I would outline your stroke. Path, outline stroke. So now they're shapes rather than strokes, and now you can join it. There we go. So now you have a way more simple shape. So I would kind of do that with both of these. I might try a different font with a little bit more personality, right? Instead of Myriad. I probably have a whole bunch of different fonts that you guys don't have, but something with just a little bit you don't have to go as silly as this, but something with a little bit more, kind of a personality. Um, and then what I would do is you're going to have to find, I would kind of refine where you have your wings. I'm just going to group these for now. Kind of have, so what I did is I selected both of these here, and then you see how the outline on this one, I clicked one more time without holding anything. Um, so this one has a little bit more of a heavy outline, so you're going to align this one to this one. So this indicates like the target. So I'm going to align the bottoms. There we go. So now they're, exactly the bottom there, or even align tops there. So you can kind of, you know, split where visually they look good. This is where a different font choice might help. Um, even if you wanted to outline the stroke, you can see how it looks. This may or may not work. But let's create outlines. I'm going to ungroup. And even if you had like, these guys up a little bit more, so it's like almost literally kind of flying away just to give it a little bit more movement, right? But I think for you, it's going to be refining this wing shape, right? So outlining the stroke and then using our Pathfinder to combine it so it's one sort of more simple shape. I think sort of finding a different font that might work for this illustration a little bit more, and then just kind of moving it around, giving it a little bit more movement to sort of finalize this one. I think would work really well. All right, so Nathaniel's, and you said that you need to finish the S and the P, which is totally fine. Yeah, I really like this idea. I like this concept. Again, I keep saying you'll have to play around, but I'm not sure if, when you already have, okay, good. This might be kind of hard to do, but if you wanted to, that's going to be tricky because there's so many here. I'm trying to select these without, there we go. If you wanted to give these guys, you'll have to get in there. I'm not going to select all of them, but when you're sort of done with these shapes, if you wanted to group them or you can use your Pathfinder, even though they're not technically connected, now they're going to be like one sort of solid shape. I might give these a little bit more space. There we go, now you have them all selected. I might give these a little bit more space and maybe even move these around a little bit. Like, you don't want to stagger them too crazy. You may or may not like that idea. But let's see if we're missing them. There we go. So once you're kind of done with where you have them, I missed this shape. Kind of play around with the location of your letters, right? So it kind of gives it a little bit more movement, right? And then what I might do is I might sort of randomize these a little bit more. Even if you've sort of started to do that, but they all look like sort of very similar. You kind of already have that there. Okay. I might refine them a little bit more, go in with your direct selection if you wanted to, even just simply kind of, obviously you would do it a little bit more refined than this, but kind of play around with the edges, give them, just tweak. You don't have to tweak them all individually, but like, really like this one, this one, this one, they all look very similar. Just give them a little bit more difference, right? And I think kind of maybe moving them around a little bit, even if you wanted to try rotating a little bit, just to give it a little bit of slight movement. You'll have to do that with, and you can even kind of almost overlap a little bit, but just to kind of give it a little bit more movement, a little bit more sort of visual interest, I guess, for lack of a better word. But yeah, I think finishing off the S and the P and then just kind of refining, selecting each element of each letter and using your Pathfinder and doing a unite so that they're all one shape to work with, I think would work really well. I like this concept. All right, and then Tristan is this one. We talked about this a bunch in class. I like this idea. You know, you have your wingdings there with mystery. Not too many people use wingdings, which is kind of fun. I like how you have your shadows. I might play around with this perspective a little bit more and see if you can sort of like pull it in towards the middle, going almost pointing towards the mystery, and then kind of do a similar thing if you could have more like perspective, even if you had the mystery down, maybe even flip your shadows, right? So you kind of have the shadows. Yours, I think, is getting more refining the shadow, right? So if you have these shadows come down here, and even have the shadows go up in the opposite way, so the perspectives kind of meet. You know, you could have like essentially like an invisible line, give or take, here in between them. So that's where your vanishing point is, right? And have the shadow on the mystery go up to the vanishing point, and the shadow from the letters or the symbols go down to the vanishing point, right? So I think it's going to be, you know, kind of playing around with that. You know, again, oops, kind of in a similar way. You know, obviously this is going to be kind of, and then if you kind of want to count a little bit, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, give or take, I'm just kind of arbitrarily, you know, and then sort of refine the bottom part of this, like bring this back up to where it's like a straight. I don't even know if can we delete those? Ooh, that deletes the whole thing. I don't like that. Does it let us delete anchor points? No, not really. I wonder if, I have a feeling this isn't going to work, but you know, even if you had, again, I think it's just kind of like flipping the shadow. I think this is part, no, it's not going to work. I think kind of like flipping that shadow, you might have to sort of go back a bunch in your file, or even recreate, um, you know, recreate the shadow you have going there. But I think kind of having like a vanishing point in the middle there and having your shadow from the top down, again, going towards the mystery and having your vanishing point here, and then your shadow for the mystery going up towards that vanishing point, I think might be kind of like a cool idea. It sort of gives it that like, not quite like a pyramid, but I think it gives it that more geometric look, if that makes sense. Since your symbols at the top are so geometric and your text at the bottom is super geometric, um, I think overall that would help to sort of like finish it off and give it that sort of like, you know, more geometric perspective. Nice.